All right, now we can just continue with this setup and add the ground explosion when he lands. First, let's add our left hand particles as well. So just Control C on the right hand, copy F2, name it left hand, connect that to our mask 2 and connect this node to our simulation node. And under rendering, let's maybe just give it a slightly more red color, so like a more saturated orange. Awesome. And so now what we want to achieve is right around this frame 650, we want there to be an explosion that comes out of his entire body. So I'll just grab this geometry, which means the whole model, drag out of that and make a new emitter volume, connect that to my simulation emitter. And for the time being, I'll just turn off everything else so we can focus on just the explosion, and we can rename it that. So explosion, reset, and now we have some fire and smoke coming out of his entire body. So I'll just go to emission. So instead of animating all of these parameters separately, we can just animate the activity for the entire emitter. So I'll just enable the keyframe for the emitter activity, hold shift, make a keyframe here and another one right here. The first one can just be set to disabled and the second one is set to enabled. Let me zoom in on my timeline, and he actually hits the ground around frame 580. So I'll move this over, make sure it gets enabled on frame 180, and I only want it to be enabled for a few frames to get that quick explosion. So just a few frames later, maybe 10 frames later, hold shift, make another keyframe and set this to disabled again. So that there need to be 4 keyframes total, disabled, enabled, it remains enabled for a few frames, and then the last one is disabled, right? So just to make sure this is working, I can go into emission, crank up the additional pressure rate to maybe 50, reset my simulation, and once it reaches the frame 580, it just flashes for a little bit. So it needs to be enabled for a longer time, so I'll just extend these keyframes. And instead of us having to wait every time for him to do his whole animation, we can just move our loop area to be right before he hits the ground. And I can also move the end of the loop closer. And now I can just reset the simulation and let it play. And after it plays once, it's only going to keep playing over and over again the moment when he hits the ground. So now we can easily keep working on this. So I still need to extend these keyframes more so that the explosion lasts longer. I will go into emission and crank up my fuel rate to maybe 300. Let's give it more smoke and let's enable the additional pressure rate and crank that up higher and higher too. All right, it's not really working right now. And I found that it's because the pressure random intensity. So as you start lowering the random intensity, the explosion will actually be allowed to escape more. So now we're starting to get something explosive. I'll just keep lowering the random intensity and it should become more and more uniform around his body. So this is starting to look pretty good, maybe around 35% for the random pressure. And I will lower the additional pressure rate because it's just too much right now, until we get a nice little blast right around his body. Maybe we can just lower the fuel rate. Cool, so this is not bad, but we need to break up the explosion so it has way more detail inside of it, and for that we can use some noise. So out of the simulation node, we can just drag out a noise force, and you see now it's just sort of broken up a bit too much because we only need the noise to be active for a few frames. So just pause the sim, set the noise to only affect the volume, not the particles. And for the force activity, let's enable the keyframe. And I only want it to be active when the explosion is exploding. So maybe for these few frames, so it's disabled here, enabled, remains enabled, and then the last frame is disabled again. And maybe we can increase the scale of this a little bit, lower the amplitude to maybe just 1, and lower the animation speed to just 1 as well. See what we get right now. Cool, I think the scale could be lower actually. And maybe the amplitude can be like 1.5. Okay, so let's extend the size of our simulation grid so we can see more of this. So on the Z, I'll just make it 150. And the explosion is just rising a bit too fast. So let's see if we can maybe just push it down with another force. So forces, line force, and I'll set the push strength to maybe minus 0.2 and make sure that I'm affecting just the volume. Let's do minus 0.1. That's still too much, so minus 0.05. Cool, so that's a nice little blast. And let's enable everything else and see how it all looks together. So right hand and emitter. All right, it's starting to look pretty cool. I love how the GPU particles are advected by the explosion. That's exactly what I had in my original example as well. Now don't forget that we can just freely move the character if he's just too close to the border. So I'll just grab him and move him back, and it shouldn't really affect anything. It should still work just fine. We can now maybe lower the Z because the explosion doesn't go up as high. So I'll just do 125, but I do need to extend it on the X-axis. So I'll do 200 over here as well. Apply new resolution. Bring our looping border back so we can see the whole animation. So I'll just extend it to the beginning and to the end and reset. Let's watch the whole thing. All right, so this is pretty awesome. The only thing I'm not liking is that our line force is pushing the GPU particles away from him, and we really only want this line force to be active when the explosion happens, which again is right here. So I just go to the line force activity, enable the keyframe, zoom in, and make sure that that force is only active for those few frames where the explosion is happening. So maybe it ends right here. So we can actually just maybe make it disabled, then it's enabled, and it remains enabled actually till the end of the loop. So we can just have 2 keyframes here, and that should fix our GPU particles on the hands, and it does. Awesome. And then the particles nicely just collide with the floor and die over time. So final touch, I will just expand the grid one more time. This is just a never-ending back and forth, so 250 by 250 by 150. That's gonna give me way more voxels. I went from 6.5 to 10.5 million voxels, so the simulation will be slower. But if you notice in my original example, it was pretty slow too. That's just because there's so much going on and I'm simulating so many voxels. But this is looking pretty awesome. So now, as always, final touches, shading, rendering. I can boost up the smoke sharpening, and I can go into the ground, turn it off, hit B to hide the grid, and maybe scene. Let's give it a bit more saturation and maybe increase the bloom intensity and the bloom radius, which just brightens up these particles beautifully. And now let's watch what we have. Final result, Control space bar to make it full screen. And here we go. And the simulation should just loop and continue one more time. So this is still definitely a very stylized explosion. I'm not going for anything ultra realistic. We're gonna work on a very realistic explosion, multiple explosions later in the course. So this is still in the magical realm for sure. Again, we've covered a lot of stuff, a lot of different techniques. Hope that you learned a lot from this, and I'll see you in the next video for another example.